I'm Marcus Thompson, 38 years old, and I work as a software engineer here in Phoenix, Arizona. Last August, during one of the most brutal heat waves we'd seen in years, my parents looked me straight in the eye and told me I needed to pack my bags and get out of my own house. Not their house. Mine, the house I'd been paying the mortgage on for 5 years. The house where I was raising my 12-year-old son Alex after his mother passed away 3 years ago. They said my sister Jessica's family needed the space more than we did, and that as the older brother, I should step up and make sacrifices. What they didn't know was that I'd already prepared for this moment, and what I was about to do would leave them all scrambling for a place to sleep. The consequences of their greed would hit them harder than the Arizona sun in July. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, I learned early that in our family, Jessica could do no wrong. She was 4 years younger than me, born when I was already reading chapter books and helping our dad Bob fix things around our cramped 2-bedroom apartment near downtown. From the moment she took her first steps, Mom and Dad treated her like she was made of spun gold while I was expected to be the responsible one, the one who never caused problems, the one who quietly did what he was told without complaint. When Jessica struggled with math in elementary school, I was pulled aside and told I needed to tutor her instead of going to computer camp. When she wanted to join dance classes that cost $200 a month, my parents found the money by canceling my robotics club membership. When she crashed Dad's truck at 17 because she was texting while driving, somehow it became my fault for not reminding her to be careful, even though I wasn't even in the vehicle. The pattern was set early and it never changed. I threw myself into my studies because it was the one place where I could prove my worth without having to compete with Jessica's tears or dramatic outbursts. While she was failing classes and staying out past curfew, I was pulling straight A's and building computers from spare parts I bought with money from my part-time job at a local electronics store. When college acceptance letters started arriving, I had my pick of engineering programs, but my parents made it clear that any money they'd saved for education would go toward Jessica's future first. I took out student loans and worked 3 jobs to get through Arizona State University, graduating with a degree in computer science and exactly $42,000 in debt. Jessica, meanwhile, dropped out of community college after 1 semester to move in with Carlos, a construction worker she'd met at a party. Mom called it true love. I called it Jessica avoiding responsibility again, but I kept that opinion to myself because I'd learned that criticizing the golden child only brought lectures about being supportive and family-minded. By the time I landed my first real job as a software engineer at 26, Jessica was already pregnant with her first child and calling our parents every week asking for money. Gas bills, grocery money, baby clothes, doctor visits that their insurance didn't cover completely. Mom and Dad would hand over whatever they could spare, and when they couldn't spare enough, they'd call me. Not ask, call and explain why I needed to help out because family takes care of family, and I was the one with the steady paycheck and no dependents. I sent money for Emma's birth, for Tyler's birth 2 years later, for Carlos when he got hurt on a job site and couldn't work for 3 months. I paid for Jessica's car repairs when her transmission went out, covered their rent twice when Carlos got laid off during a slow construction season, and bought plane tickets so they could visit our parents for Christmas 2 years running. Every time I wrote a check or sent a transfer, I told myself it was temporary, that they'd get back on their feet, that eventually the calls would stop coming. The calls never stopped coming. If anything, they got more frequent and the amounts got bigger. Jessica had developed an expensive taste for organic everything and designer baby clothes, even though they were living paycheck to paycheck. Carlos had started a side business selling handmade furniture that required constant startup capital but never seemed to turn a profit. They were spending money they didn't have and expecting me to cover the difference because, in their minds, my software engineer salary meant I was swimming in cash. What they didn't understand was that I was also raising Alex alone after his mother Sarah died in a car accident when he was 9. Sarah had been my college girlfriend who came back into my life when Alex was 6. telling me I had a son I'd never known about. We'd tried to make it work as a family, and for 3 years we did pretty well. Alex was smart like me, curious about how things worked, eager to learn programming languages and build things with his hands. When Sarah died, I became his sole support system overnight, and suddenly every financial decision I made had to account for his future. I bought the house in Scottsdale because the school district was excellent and Alex needed stability after losing his mom. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small pool in the backyard, and a 2-car garage where Alex and I could work on projects together. The mortgage was $1,500 a month, manageable on my salary, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something that would last. Alex loved having his own room, loved the garage workshop where we built robots and programmed Arduino boards, loved the neighborhood kids who shared his interest in video games and science fiction. For 2 years, our life was good. I worked from home most days, which meant I could pick Alex up from school and help with homework. We had routines that worked, friends who included both of us in their plans, a comfortable rhythm that felt like the family I'd always wanted but never had growing up. Alex was thriving academically and socially, already talking about wanting to study computer science like his dad. I was proud of what we'd built together, proud of the home we'd made. Then Jessica's landlord decided to sell the duplex they'd been renting in Tempe, and suddenly my peaceful life became everyone else's emergency. The eviction notice gave them 30 days to find a new place, but in a housing market where rent prices had doubled in 3 years and landlords wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit up front, 30 days might as well have been 30 minutes. Jessica called Mom crying about how they couldn't find anything they could afford, how the kids would have to change schools, how Carlos was working overtime but it still wasn't enough. Mom called me the next day with a solution that made my blood run cold. Jessica and her family would move in with me temporarily, just until they got back on their feet financially. It would be good for Alex to have cousins around, she said. It would be good for Jessica to have help with the kids. It would be good for everyone, and since I had the space and the stable income, it was really the only logical choice. When I pointed out that 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms wasn't really enough space for 7 people, Mom's voice got sharp in that way it always did when I wasn't being cooperative enough. I tried explaining that Alex and I had routines, that he was doing well in school, that disrupting our household would be hard on him. I tried mentioning that Carlos had a temper and I didn't want that energy around my son. I tried suggesting they look at cheaper areas outside Phoenix, maybe Tucson or Flagstaff, where rent was more manageable. Every objection I raised was met with guilt trips about family loyalty and reminders of how much help I'd received over the years, which was funny since I couldn't remember receiving much help at all. The conversation ended with Mom telling me that Jessica would be calling to work out the details and that she knew I'd do the right thing because I'd always been the responsible one. The responsible one, that phrase had followed me my entire life, used as both praise and manipulation depending on what my family needed from me at any given moment.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I was responsible when they needed money, responsible when they needed someone to clean up Jessica's messes, responsible when they needed a scapegoat for problems I hadn't created. When Jessica called that evening, she was already talking like the decision had been made. She'd checked out the school district and it was actually better than where Emma and Tyler had been going. She'd looked at my house on Google Street View and thought the backyard would be perfect for the kids to play in. She'd calculated that if I wasn't using the master bedroom, she and Carlos could take that while I moved to the smaller bedroom, and the kids could share the 3rd bedroom. Alex could sleep on the couch in the living room, or maybe we could put a daybed in the garage since he liked spending time out there anyway. I listened to her reorganize my life and my son's life without once asking what we wanted or needed, without once acknowledging that she was asking me to turn our home upside down for her convenience. When I tried to discuss logistics, like how 7 people would share 2 bathrooms or where everyone would park their cars, she brushed off my concerns with airy assurances that we'd figure it out as we went along. When I suggested a timeline for how long this arrangement would last, she got defensive and accused me of being unwelcoming before they'd even moved in. The truth was, I could see exactly how this would play out. Jessica and Carlos would move in with no clear plan for moving out. They'd take over the common areas, eat our food, disrupt Alex's study time with their loud conversations and television shows. Carlos would leave his work boots by the front door and his tools scattered around the garage. Jessica would rearrange my kitchen to suit her cooking style and complain that the house rules were too strict for her kids. Emma and Tyler would bounce off the walls in the way that kids do, and Alex would retreat to his room or the garage to avoid the chaos. Within a month, they'd be talking about how cramped the house was and how we needed to look for a bigger place together. Within 2 months, they'd be suggesting that since we were all splitting expenses anyway, maybe we should look at buying something larger as a family investment. Within 3 months, I'd be the bad guy for wanting them to move out, accused of caring more about my comfort than my family's well-being. I'd seen this movie before with every loan I'd given them, every bill I'd paid, every crisis I'd helped them navigate. But this time was different because this wasn't about money I could afford to lose. This was about the home I'd built for Alex and me, the stability I'd worked so hard to create after Sarah's death, the one space in the world where we could be ourselves without having to manage other people's emotions or problems. This was about my son's bedroom, his school routine, his sense of security in a world that had already taken his mother away. I couldn't let Jessica's poor planning destroy what Alex and I had built together. I told Jessica I needed a few days to think about it and discuss it with Alex. She immediately got upset, saying that time was running out and they needed to know where they were going to live. I held firm, explaining that this was a major decision that would affect Alex's life too, and he deserved to have a voice in what happened to his home. Jessica huffed and said she'd call Mom, which was exactly what I expected. Jessica always called Mom when she didn't get her way immediately. Mom called me an hour later, and this time Dad was on the line too. They tag-teamed me with guilt and logic, explaining that Jessica had nowhere else to turn, that the kids would be traumatized by homelessness, that I had the resources to help and therefore the responsibility to do so. When I mentioned Alex's needs, they dismissed them with comments about how resilient kids are and how good it would be for him to learn about family sacrifice. When I talked about the impact on my work-from-home setup, they suggested I could rent office space somewhere else since I was making good money. Every practical concern I raised was met with a guilt trip, every boundary I tried to establish was labeled as selfish. Every attempt to discuss alternatives was shot down as unrealistic or unkind. By the end of the call, they'd made it clear that refusing to house Jessica's family would be seen as a betrayal of everything they'd taught me about family loyalty, and that my relationship with all of them would suffer if I didn't step up in this moment of crisis. I hung up the phone feeling like I was 12 years old again, being told that my computer camp didn't matter as much as Jessica's dance classes. The same dynamic that had shaped my entire childhood was still running my adult life, still prioritizing Jessica's immediate wants over my long-term needs, still treating my home and my income as resources that belonged to the family rather than to me and Alex. That night, I sat Alex down for a conversation I'd been dreading. I explained the situation honestly, told him that Aunt Jessica's family needed a place to stay and that Grandma and Grandpa thought we should help by letting them move in with us. Alex listened quietly, his face getting more serious as I talked. When I finished, he asked the question I'd been hoping he wouldn't ask. Dad, do I have to give up my room? I looked at this kid who'd already lost so much, who'd adapted to his mother's death, and a new school, and a father who was still learning how to raise a child alone, and I realized that I was about to ask him to give up the one space in the world that was completely his. His room where he kept his books and his computer projects and his model airplanes. His room where he felt safe and comfortable and free to be himself. His room that represented stability in a life that had already seen too much change. I don't know yet, buddy, I told him, which was honest but not reassuring. We're still figuring out the details. Alex nodded, but I could see the worry in his eyes. That night, I heard him on the phone with his friend Jake, explaining that his cousins might be moving in and everything was going to change. The resignation in his voice broke my heart. He wasn't complaining or arguing, he was just accepting that his needs would come second to other people's emergencies, the same lesson I'd learned at his age and apparently never unlearned. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, thinking about the house I'd bought to give Alex stability, the home we'd built together after Sarah died, the life we'd carved out that finally felt like ours. I thought about Jessica's pattern of creating crises and expecting other people to solve them, about my parents' pattern of enabling her by guilting me into compliance. I thought about Alex's quiet acceptance of a situation that would disrupt everything he'd come to depend on. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I realized that I was done being the responsible one. I was done sacrificing my son's well-being for Jessica's convenience. I was done letting my parents manipulate me with guilt trips about family loyalty while they showed no loyalty to Alex and me. I was done being the solution to problems I didn't create, the bank account that never closed, the safety net that caught everyone except the people who lived in my house. The decision I made that night would change everything. Not just for me and Alex, but for Jessica and Carlos and my parents too. They'd pushed me to the breaking point by asking me to sacrifice my son's home for their peace of mind, and they were about to learn that even the most responsible person has limits. They were about to discover that taking advantage of someone's generosity for years doesn't guarantee they'll keep giving forever, especially when their child's happiness is on the line. What I was planning would shock them all. It would force them to confront the consequences of their choices without me there to cushion the impact. It would teach them that family loyalty goes both ways, and that treating someone like an ATM eventually makes them close the account. Most importantly, it would show Alex that sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is refuse to be responsible for other people's problems. The heat wave was just beginning, but the storm I was about to unleash would be unlike anything Phoenix had ever seen. Parts 2 might, the catalyst and escalation. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Alex was already at the kitchen table, eating cereal and working on a programming assignment for his computer club. The morning sun was streaming through our windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, and everything felt normal and peaceful in a way that I knew was about to be shattered forever. I poured myself coffee and sat down across from my son, watching him type code into his laptop with the kind of focused concentration that reminded me of myself at his age. "Dad," Alex said without looking up from his screen, "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About Aunt Jessica's family maybe moving in with us." I set down my coffee cup, preparing myself for whatever he was about to say. Alex had always been mature for his age, forced to grow up faster after his mother's death, but he was still just 12 years old, and this situation wasn't fair to dump on his shoulders. "What are you thinking, buddy?" Alex saved his work and closed the laptop, meeting my eyes with a seriousness that made my chest tight. "I know Grandma and Grandpa think we should help, and I know Aunt Jessica needs somewhere to live. But this is our house, Dad. You bought it for us after Mom died, and it's the first place that's felt like home since everything changed. I don't want to lose that." The honesty in his voice, the way he was trying to be mature about an impossible situation, made me realize that I'd already made my decision. This kid had been through enough upheaval in his short life. He deserved to keep the one stable thing we'd built together, the home where he felt safe and secure and free to be himself. Jessica's emergency didn't trump Alex's need for stability, no matter what my parents believed about family hierarchy. "You're not going to lose it," I told him, and as I said the words, I felt the weight of that promise settle in my chest. "This is your home, Alex. Our home. And nobody gets to take that away from us." Alex smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since this whole situation started. "Thanks, Dad. I was worried I was being selfish for not wanting to share my room with Tyler. He's a good kid, but he's 5 and he breaks things accidentally, and I have a lot of computer equipment that can't be replaced easily." That afternoon, I called Jessica back with my decision. I'd spent hours crafting what I was going to say, trying to find words that were firm but not cruel, clear but not argumentative. I explained that after talking with Alex and thinking about our living situation, I didn't think my house was the right solution for her family. I offered to help her look for other options, suggested some apartment complexes in cheaper areas of Phoenix, even volunteered to help with a security deposit if that would make the difference in getting approved somewhere. Jessica's reaction was immediate and explosive. Her voice went from confused to angry to devastated in the span of 30 seconds. How could I be so heartless when her children were facing homelessness? How could I prioritize my comfort over family? What kind of brother lets his sister's kids sleep in a car when he has empty bedrooms in his house? The questions came rapid fire, each one designed to make me feel guilty for having boundaries. When I tried to explain that it wasn't about comfort but about stability for Alex, Jessica scoffed. Alex is one kid, Marcus. I have 2 children who need help right now. 2 kids who are going to be traumatized by this experience because their uncle cares more about his precious routine than their well-being. The accusation stung because it was designed to, but I held my ground. I offered again to help with apartment hunting, to provide references for rental applications, to loan money for deposits if needed. Every practical solution I suggested was dismissed as inadequate or insulting. Jessica didn't want help finding another option. She wanted me to solve her problem by sacrificing my son's stability, and when I refused, she escalated. "I'm calling Mom," she said, her voice cold with fury. "She's going to hear about how you're abandoning your family in our darkest hour. Don't expect to be welcome at family gatherings anymore, Marcus. Don't expect us to pretend you're a good person when you've shown your true colors." The line went dead, and I sat in my kitchen holding the silent phone, feeling like I was 12 years old again and bracing myself for the parental lecture that was surely coming. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in years of dealing with Jessica's dramatics and my parents' guilt trips. I felt proud of myself for choosing Alex's needs over their manipulation tactics. The call from my parents came 2 hours later. Mom was crying before she even said hello, which was her standard opening move when Jessica had gotten to her first. Dad's voice in the background was gruff with disappointment, the same tone he'd used when I was a kid and had let the family down somehow. They tag-teamed me with a 40-minute conversation that hit every guilt button they'd installed during my childhood. I was being selfish. I was forgetting where I came from. I was prioritizing material possessions over human relationships. I was setting a terrible example for Alex by showing him that family doesn't help family in times of crisis. I was breaking Jessica's heart and traumatizing her children and destroying the family bonds that were supposed to last a lifetime. When they finished with the emotional manipulation, they moved on to practical arguments. The house had 3 bedrooms and I was only using 2. Alex could easily share space with his cousins, and it might even be good for him to learn about compromise and flexibility. I worked from home most days, so the noise and chaos wouldn't affect me the way it would someone who had to commute to an office. I made enough money to absorb the increased utility costs and grocery bills, so really this was more of an inconvenience than a hardship. Every point they made revealed how little they understood about my actual life or Alex's actual needs. They saw empty space that could be filled, extra income that could be shared, and flexibility that could be exploited. They didn't see the home office where I took client calls and worked on complex coding projects that required concentration. They didn't see Alex's study area where he did homework and practiced programming. They didn't see the quiet routines and peaceful environment that had allowed both of us to heal after Sarah's death. I tried explaining these things, but every point I made was countered with dismissive comments about how adaptable kids are or how I was overcomplicating a simple situation. When I mentioned that Alex had specifically asked not to give up his room, Mom sighed like I was being manipulated by a child who didn't understand what was best for the family. "Alex is 12, Marcus," she said in that patient voice she used when she thought I was being particularly dense. "He doesn't get to make decisions about family responsibilities. You're the adult, and sometimes being an adult means making sacrifices for the people you love." "What about the sacrifices Jessica needs to make?" I asked. "What about her taking responsibility for her own housing situation instead of expecting other people to solve it for her?" The silence on the line was deafening. Then Dad's voice, heavy with disappointment, "Son, I never thought I'd hear you talk about your sister like that. Jessica's going through a hard time, and family is supposed to rally around each other during hard times." "I've been rallying around Jessica for 15 years, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I've paid her bills, covered her rent, bought her groceries, funded Carlos's business ventures. I've been the family ATM since the day I got my first real job, and I've never complained because I thought that's what family does. But this isn't about money, Dad. This is about my son's home." "It's your home too," Mom chimed in. "And homes are meant to be shared with family when family needs help. Then why isn't Jessica moving in with you and Dad?" I asked the question I'd been holding back, the one that cut to the heart of their hypocrisy. You have a two-bedroom apartment. It would be cramped, but if family is supposed to help family, why aren't you making room? Another silence, longer this time. When Mom spoke again, her voice was defensive. Our apartment isn't big enough for 4 extra people. We barely have room for ourselves. And you think my house is big enough for 6 extra people? You think Alex and I won't be cramped? You think our routines and our peace won't be disrupted? That's different, Dad said, but he couldn't explain how it was different without admitting that they expected me to make sacrifices they weren't willing to make themselves. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes before I finally ended it by saying I needed to pick Alex up from his friend's house. I promised to think about what they'd said, knowing that thinking about it wouldn't change my mind but hoping it would buy me some time before the next guilt trip phone call. That evening Alex and I ordered pizza and watched a movie, maintaining our normal Friday night routine as if the family drama wasn't swirling around us like a dust storm. But I could see the tension in Alex's shoulders, the way he kept glancing at my phone whenever it buzzed with text messages from Jessica or my parents. He was trying to act normal for my benefit, the same way I'd tried to act normal for his benefit after his mother died. Dad, he said during a quiet moment in the movie, are you in trouble with Grandma and Grandpa because of me, because I don't want to share my room? The question broke my heart because it revealed how much he'd absorbed from growing up in our family dynamics, how he'd learned to blame himself for adult problems the same way I had at his age. I paused the movie and turned to face him fully. You are not in trouble, and you are not the reason for any problems, I told him firmly. The adults in this situation are having a disagreement about what's best for everyone, but you didn't cause this problem and you can't solve it. The only job you have is to be 12 years old and let me worry about the grown-up stuff. Alex nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd seen too much of how our family operated, heard too many phone calls where my parents questioned my parenting decisions or Jessica complained about not getting enough help. He'd learned that being the reason someone couldn't help meant being the bad guy, and I hated that my family had taught him that lesson. The weekend passed quietly, but I knew the temporary peace wouldn't last. Jessica had 10 days left before her eviction became final, and she wasn't going to give up on pressuring me into housing her family. My parents weren't going to stop calling with new arguments about why I should sacrifice Alex's stability for Jessica's convenience. The situation was going to escalate, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. On Sunday evening, I did something I'd never done before in any family crisis. I called my friend Kevin Park, who'd been my study partner in college and was now a successful accountant with his own practice. Kevin had met my family at a few barbecues over the years and had always been diplomatically silent about their dynamics, but I knew he'd seen enough to understand what I was dealing with. Marcus, man, you sound stressed, Kevin said when I explained the situation. Let me get this straight. Your sister got evicted from her rental, and now your parents want you to house her entire family in your 3-bedroom house, displacing your kid from his own room? That's the simplified version. But yeah, that's what's happening. Kevin was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications. As an accountant, he was used to looking at situations objectively, weighing costs and benefits without getting tangled up in emotional manipulation. Marcus, I've gotta ask this, and don't take it the wrong way, but why is this even a question? It's your house, your mortgage, your kid's home. Since when do your parents get to decide who lives there? The question was so simple and so obvious that I almost laughed. Since when indeed? Since when? Had I been required to get my parents' approval for decisions about my own property and my own child? Since when had Jessica's needs automatically trumped Alex's needs just because she was louder about expressing them? I guess I've been conditioned to think that saying no to family makes me the bad guy, I admitted. Jessica's always been the one who gets help, and I've always been the one who provides it. It's been that way for so long that I forgot I had a choice. You definitely have a choice, Kevin said firmly, and from where I'm sitting, it seems like an easy one. Alex has already lost his mom and had to move to a new school. The kid needs stability, not chaos. Jessica and Carlos are adults with their own responsibilities. If they can't manage their housing situation, that's their problem to solve. Hearing someone else validate what I'd been feeling made something relax in my chest. Kevin wasn't family, so he wasn't invested in maintaining the dysfunction that had shaped our relationships for decades. He could see the situation clearly, without all the guilt and manipulation clouding his judgment. The thing is, I continued, I know this is going to blow up. Jessica's going to make me the villain in this story. My parents are going to side with her because they always do. I'm probably going to lose my relationship with all of them over this. Maybe Kevin agreed. But what kind of relationship is it really, if it only works when you're giving them what they want? What kind of family treats you like an ATM and then gets angry when you finally close the account? His words hit like a cold splash of water. What kind of family, indeed? I'd been so focused on maintaining peace and avoiding conflict that I'd never stopped to ask whether the relationships I was preserving were actually worth preserving. I'd been so afraid of being labeled selfish that I'd forgotten to consider whether my family's demands were reasonable. There's something else, Kevin said, his voice more serious. If you let them move in now, when do they move out? What's the exit strategy? Because from what I know about your sister, she's not great at planning ahead or taking responsibility for her own problems. It was the question I'd been avoiding because I already knew the answer. There was no exit strategy because Jessica didn't want a temporary solution. She wanted a permanent solution to her housing problems, one that didn't require her to budget better or make difficult choices about what she could afford. She wanted to move into my house and stay there until I found them something better, which could be months or years depending on how motivated she was to change her situation. You're right, I said. If I let them move in, they'll never leave voluntarily. And if I try to make them leave, I'll be the heartless brother who kicked out his sister and her kids. Exactly. So the real question isn't whether you should help Jessica. The real question is whether you should sacrifice your son's stability and your own peace of mind for people who will never appreciate the sacrifice and will always expect more. By the time I hung up the phone, I felt like I'd been given permission to trust my own instincts instead of my family's guilt trips. Kevin was right, this wasn't about whether I loved my family or cared about Jessica's problems. This was about whether I was going to protect what Alex and I had built together, or let other people's poor choices destroy our stability. Monday morning brought a new development that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. Jessica called at 7:30 in the morning, waking both Alex and me with the urgent ringing of the phone. Her voice was different this time, less angry and more desperate, which should have been my first warning that something significant had shifted. Marcus, I need you to listen to me without interrupting, she said, her words coming fast like she'd rehearsed them. Carlos and I have been talking, and we've come up with a solution that works for everyone. We're going to move in with you temporarily, but we're also going to contribute to the household expenses and help with Alex. It'll be like having built-in babysitters and housekeepers, and you won't have to worry about Alex being alone after school anymore. I was still half asleep, but alarm bells were already ringing in my head. Jessica was presenting this like she was doing me a favor, like her family moving into my house was actually a gift I should be grateful to receive. She was reframing the entire situation to make it seem like I needed them as much as they needed me. Jessica, we already talked about this. I started, but she cut me off. No, you talked and I listened. Now I'm talking, and you need to listen. Mom and Dad are coming over this afternoon to help us work out the details. We've already started packing because the truck is coming on Thursday, and we don't have time for more back and forth. Emma and Tyler were excited about living with their cousin Alex, and Carlos has heirs. Some ideas about how to improve your backyard that won't cost you anything. The presumption in her voice, the assumption that the decision had already been made despite my clear refusal, made my blood pressure spike. Jessica wasn't asking for help anymore. She was informing me of what was going to happen, as if my house belonged to the family collective rather than to me and Alex specifically. Jessica, stop, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through her monologue. Nothing has been decided. I told you this wasn't going to work, and that hasn't changed. You need to find another solution. There is no other solution, she shouted, her desperation finally breaking through the fake cheerfulness. Do you understand that, Marcus? There is nowhere else for us to go. Every apartment we've looked at wants 3 times the rent in upfront money, which we don't have. Every extended stay hotel costs more per week than we make in a month. My kids are going to be homeless because their uncle won't help them when he easily could. The guilt trip was expertly deployed, designed to make me feel responsible for her family's homelessness. But I'd had 3 days to think about Kevin's questions and to remember what my priorities actually were. I wasn't responsible for Jessica's poor financial planning. I wasn't obligated to sacrifice Alex's well-being to solve problems I didn't create. I'm sorry you're in this situation, I said, and I meant it, but moving in with Alex and me isn't the answer. It's not fair to any of us, especially the kids. Fair? Jessica's voice went shrill. You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that you have 3 bedrooms and only use 2? Is it fair that Alex gets his own pool and his own garage workshop while my kids don't even have their own beds? Is it fair that you make 6 figures while Carlos breaks his back in construction for a fraction of that? Every word revealed how Jessica really felt about my life and my choices. She didn't see the house as something I'd worked for and earned. She saw it as excess that should be shared, resources that belonged to the family rather than to the person who paid for them. She didn't see Alex's stability as something precious that needed protecting. She saw it as selfishness that needed correcting. Life isn't fair, Jessica, I said quietly. But that doesn't mean I'm obligated to make your life easier by making Alex's life harder. The silence that followed was loaded with fury. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was cold as winter in Flagstaff. Fine. But when Mom and Dad find out how selfish you're being, don't expect them to keep pretending you're the good son. And don't expect me to keep Alex's secrets when he starts acting out because his father cares more about his precious house than his family. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jessica was going to turn my parents against me completely, and she was going to use Alex as a weapon in that campaign. She was going to paint me as a selfish father who prioritized material possessions over family relationships, and she was going to make Alex feel guilty for being the reason I couldn't help. You do what you think you need to do, I told her. But Alex and I aren't changing our minds. We'll see about that, Jessica said and hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding the silent phone, watching Alex eat his cereal and try to pretend he hadn't heard every word of the conversation. The morning sun was still streaming through the windows, but the peace I'd felt earlier was completely shattered. Jessica had just declared war, and she was planning to use our parents and our son as ammunition. The battle for my house and Alex's stability was about to begin in earnest, and I was finally ready to fight back. The sound of the garage door opener woke me at 5:30 in the morning, which was impossible because Alex and I were both inside the house and neither of us had touched the remote. I rolled out of bed and peered through my bedroom window to see Jessica's minivan backing out of my garage, followed by Carlos wheeling out what looked like Alex's expensive 3D printer. The violation was so brazen, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't process what I was seeing. They weren't just trying to move into my house anymore, they were stealing from it. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I ran outside, my bare feet hitting the scorching concrete of my driveway. The Phoenix sun hadn't even fully risen yet, but the pavement was already radiating heat that would build to unbearable levels within hours. Jessica saw me coming and had the audacity to wave cheerfully, as if loading stolen electronics into her van at dawn was a perfectly normal family activity. "Good morning, Marcus," she called out with that same bright fake smile I'd seen her use on store clerks when returning items she'd clearly used and damaged. "We're just picking up a few things we'll need for the kids' education." Alex won't mind sharing his equipment with his cousins, especially since Emma is showing such an interest in technology. The twisted logic was breathtaking. She was stealing my son's belongings and framing it as generous sharing, as if Alex had volunteered to donate his most prized possessions to children he barely knew. The 3D printer alone had cost me $800, money I'd saved for months to surprise Alex on his 12th birthday. He'd spent countless hours learning to use it, creating everything from replacement parts for broken household items to original sculptures that decorated his room. "Put it back, Jessica," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "That printer belongs to Alex, and you have no right to take it." Carlos emerged from my garage, carrying Alex's laptop bag and a box of programming books, his face set in the aggressive expression I'd learned to recognize as his response to any challenge to his authority. He was bigger than me and used to getting his way through intimidation, but this was my property and my son's possessions he was stealing. "We're not taking anything that won't be shared," he said, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone trying to justify inexcusable behavior. "The kids are going to be living together anyway, so it makes sense for them to share resources. Emma and Tyler have never had access to educational tools like this, and Alex has been hoarding them in his room like they're too good for his cousins." The accusation that Alex was hoarding his own belongings in his own room was so absurd that I almost laughed, but the sight of them loading my son's treasured possessions into their van killed any amusement I might have felt. These weren't just expensive items they were stealing. These were tools Alex used for learning, for creating, for exploring his interests in technology and engineering. Taking them wasn't just theft, it was an attack on his intellectual development and his sense of security in his own home. "Those books and that equipment were bought specifically for Alex," I said, pulling out my phone to document what was happening. "They're not family property to be redistributed. They're his personal possessions, and you're stealing them." Jessica's face hardened when she saw me recording, her fake cheerfulness disappearing like morning frost under the desert sun. "We're not stealing anything, Marcus. We're equalizing resources within the family. You've been hoarding wealth and opportunity while Jessica's children go without basic educational tools. This is what family justice looks like." The phrase family justice made my blood run cold because it revealed the depth of entitlement Jessica felt toward everything I'd worked to provide for Alex. In her twisted worldview, my son's possessions were excessive luxury that should be redistributed to her children, regardless of who had earned the money to buy them or who actually owned them. She saw herself as some kind of Robin Hood, stealing from the rich uncle to give to the poor nieces and nephews, never mind that the rich uncle was a single father working to provide educational opportunities for his own child. "Family justice would be you taking responsibility for your own children's education instead of stealing from mine," I said, moving to block Carlos from reaching the garage again. "Family justice would be you getting jobs and budgeting your money instead of taking what doesn't belong to you." Carlos dropped the box he was carrying and stepped toward me with the menacing posture that had probably served him well in construction site disputes. "You want to talk about what belongs to who? Let me tell you something, Marcus. That kid of yours has more educational toys than he knows what to do with, while my kids have been making do with dollar store coloring books. You think that's fair? You think that's what family looks like?" The false choice was expertly presented, designed to make me feel guilty for providing educational opportunities for my own son while Jessica's children had less. But the comparison ignored the fundamental reality that I was Alex's father, responsible for his education and development, while Carlos and Jessica were responsible for their own children's needs. I'd worked overtime and saved money to buy Alex quality educational tools because investing in his future was my job as his parent. "What's fair is parents taking care of their own children," I replied, my voice getting stronger as my initial shock gave way to righteous anger. "What's fair is not stealing from other people's kids to make up for your own poor planning." What's fair is earning money and buying your own educational materials instead of taking what someone else worked for. The sound of a car door slamming made us all turn toward the street where a Phoenix police patrol car had just parked at the curb. Officer Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman with the calm authority that came from years of dealing with domestic disputes, walked up my driveway with the measured pace of someone assessing a potentially volatile situation. "Good morning, folks," she said, her eyes moving between the van full of electronics and the box of books scattered on the ground where Carlos had dropped them. "We got a call about a possible theft in progress. Can someone explain what's happening here?" I realized that one of my neighbors must have seen Jessica and Carlos loading items from my garage and called the police, which meant this situation was about to escalate beyond family drama into actual legal consequences. Jessica's face went pale as she understood that her family justice could result in criminal charges, while Carlos's aggressive posture deflated as he recognized the authority he couldn't intimidate. "Officer Santos," I said, reading her name badge, "I'm Marcus Thompson, and this is my house. These people are my sister Jessica and her husband Carlos. They've taken several items from my garage without permission, including an expensive 3D printer and computer equipment that belongs to my son." Officer Santos nodded and pulled out a small notepad, her professional demeanor suggesting she'd handled similar family disputes before. "Ma'am," she said to Jessica, "do you have permission to remove these items from Mr. Thompson's property?" Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice, her usual eloquence deserting her in the face of official questioning. "We're family," she finally managed. "Marcus has been selfish about sharing resources, so we were just equalizing things for the children." The explanation sounded even more ridiculous when delivered to a police officer who had no emotional investment in our family dynamics. Officer Santos wrote something in her notepad, then looked at Carlos with the same neutral expression. "Sir, did you remove any items from the garage behind me?" Carlos nodded reluctantly, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Yeah, but like my wife said, we're family. The kids are supposed to be sharing this stuff anyway." Officer Santos closed her notepad and looked at me with expression that suggested she'd already reached a conclusion about the situation. "Mr. Thompson, are these people authorized to enter your property or remove any items from your garage?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I've told them repeatedly that they don't have permission to be here or take anything. They've been pressuring me to let them move into my house, and when I refused, they apparently decided to take my son's belongings without asking." The officer nodded and turned back to Jessica and Carlos, her tone becoming more official. "Ma'am, sir, I need you to return all items to Mr. Thompson's garage immediately. Taking someone else's property without permission, even family members, constitutes theft under Arizona law. You have two choices here. You can put everything back right now and leave the property voluntarily, or I can arrest you both for theft and trespassing." Jessica's face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her sense of entitlement. She'd pushed the boundaries so far beyond reasonable family behavior that she was now facing criminal charges, something that hadn't occurred to her when she'd planned this morning's operation. "We can't be arrested," she said desperately. "We have children who depend on us. We were just trying to make sure all the kids had equal opportunities." "Ma'am, your intentions don't change the fact that you took someone else's property without permission," Officer Santos replied matter-of-factly. "Thompson is the legal owner of these items, and he has the right to decide who has access to them. Your family relationship doesn't give you the right to take his possessions." Carlos began unloading the van with the defeated movements of a man who'd run out of intimidation tactics and faced the consequences of his choices. Jessica stood crying on my driveway, her grand plan to redistribute family resources crumbling in the face of legal reality. The educational justice she'd claimed to represent was revealed as simple theft, dressed up in emotional manipulation about fairness and family obligation. As they returned Alex's belongings to the garage, I watched Jessica's transformation from entitled victim to actual criminal defendant. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, moved from emotional manipulation to actual theft, and the consequences were finally catching up with her, in a way that couldn't be solved by guilt trips or family pressure. Marcus, Jessica said as Carlos loaded the last box back into the garage, this doesn't have to ruin our relationship. We can work this out as family, without involving the police anymore. The attempted manipulation was almost impressive in its audacity. Even facing potential arrest, Jessica was still trying to frame the situation as a family dispute that should be resolved privately, rather than a criminal matter that had required police intervention. She still believed that family relationships gave her special privileges that should override legal consequences. Our relationship was ruined the moment you decided to steal from my son, I told her quietly. This isn't about family anymore, Jessica. This is about you choosing to commit crimes rather than accept responsibility for your own problems. Officer Santos finished writing her report and looked at all of us with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money and property. Mr. Thompson, all of your items have been returned. Do you want to press charges for the theft and trespassing? The question hung in the air like the heat that was already building as the Phoenix sun climbed higher. I looked at Jessica crying on my driveway, at Carlos staring at the ground with his hands shoved in his pockets, and realized I was facing a choice that would define our family relationships forever. I could let this go and enable their behavior to continue, or I could follow through with consequences that would make it impossible to pretend this was normal family conflict. Yes, I said, my voice steady despite the significance of the moment. I want to press charges. They need to understand that stealing is stealing, even when it's from family. Jessica's crying intensified as Officer Santos explained that she and Carlos would need to appear in court to face theft and trespassing charges. The criminal justice system would now determine the consequences of their choices, removing the decision from family dynamics where guilt and manipulation could influence outcomes. As the police car drove away with Jessica and Carlos in the back seat, I stood in my driveway, watching their van disappear around the corner, loaded with their own belongings, but none of mine. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of air conditioners fighting against the rising heat, and I realized that the battle for my boundaries was finally over. Jessica had escalated the conflict beyond anything I could have imagined, and in doing so, she'd proven that my instincts about protecting Alex and our home had been absolutely correct. The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Amanda Rodriguez arrived within an hour of my call, bringing legal documents that would formalize the trespassing order and ensure that Jessica and Carlos couldn't return to my property. Kevin came over with coffee and moral support, helping me process the morning's events and their implications for the future. I can't believe they actually broke into your garage, Kevin said as we sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by police reports and legal papers. That's not family drama, Marcus, that's criminal behavior. I keep waiting to feel guilty about having them arrested. I admitted, they're family, and they have kids who are going to be affected by this. But I also know that if I'd let this slide, it would have sent the message that they can take whatever they want from us without consequences. Amanda looked up from the documents she was reviewing and nodded approvingly. You made the right choice, Marcus. Theft is theft, regardless of family relationships. If you'd allowed this behavior to continue, it would have escalated even further. Jessica and Carlos needed to learn that there are legal boundaries they can't cross, even with people they're related to. That afternoon, Alex came home from summer camp full of excitement about a robotics project they'd started, completely unaware that his educational equipment had been stolen and recovered while he was gone. I decided not to tell him about the morning's events immediately, wanting to preserve his sense of security, while I figured out how to explain that his aunt and uncle had tried to steal his belongings. but Alex was more perceptive than I'd given him credit for, and he noticed immediately that something was different when he went to check on his 3D printer in the garage. "Dad, did someone move my printer?" he asked, studying the slight changes in how his workspace was organized. "Everything's in the wrong place." I sat down with Alex and explained what had happened in terms a 13-year-old could understand, focusing on the fact that some adults had made very poor choices and were now facing the consequences of those choices. I emphasized that none of this was his fault and that his belongings were safe and would remain in his possession. "Aunt Jessica tried to take my printer," Alex asked, his voice more confused than angry. "Why would she do that? If Emma wanted to learn about 3D printing, I would have been happy to teach her." The innocent question highlighted the fundamental difference between Alex's generous spirit and Jessica's entitled mindset. My son would have gladly shared his knowledge and even his equipment if he'd been asked respectfully, but Jessica had chosen to steal rather than simply ask for help or cooperation. "Some adults have trouble asking for help appropriately," I explained. "Instead of talking to us about Emma's interest in technology, Aunt Jessica decided to take your equipment without asking. That's not how healthy families work." Alex nodded thoughtfully, processing the information with the maturity he'd developed from dealing with loss and change throughout his young life. "Are we going to see Aunt Jessica anymore?" he asked. "Not for a while," I admitted. "She and Uncle Carlos made choices that crossed important boundaries, and there need to be consequences for those choices before we can consider rebuilding any kind of relationship." That evening, as Alex worked on his robotics project in the garage, with all his equipment safely restored, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed over the past few months. The family relationships I'd spent years trying to preserve through financial support and emotional accommodation had been destroyed by Jessica's escalating demands and criminal behavior. But what I'd gained was more valuable than what I'd lost. I'd gained the knowledge that I could protect what mattered most, even when it required standing up to people I loved. I'd gained confidence in my ability to set and maintain boundaries, even under extreme pressure. Most importantly, I'd gained Alex's trust that his home was truly safe, that his father would protect their sanctuary from anyone who tried to violate it. The criminal charges against Jessica and Carlos would work their way through the court system over the following months, but the immediate crisis was over. They'd learned that family relationships don't override legal boundaries, that stealing is stealing, regardless of the justification, and that some lines can't be crossed without serious consequences. My parents never called to apologize or acknowledge that they'd been wrong about Jessica's character and intentions. The mutual acquaintances who'd initially sided with Jessica's version of events gradually learned the full story and realized that my boundaries hadn't been selfish but necessary. Some relationships were damaged beyond repair, but others grew stronger as people saw that I was willing to protect my son and our home from exploitation. As summer turned to fall, Alex and I settled into new routines that didn't include the constant drama of family crises and financial emergencies. We took weekend trips to explore Arizona's national parks, something we'd never had time for when I was constantly managing other people's problems. We worked on projects together in the garage, read books on the couch, and enjoyed the peaceful quiet of a home that truly belonged to us. The house that Jessica had tried to claim, the belongings she'd attempted to steal, the life she'd wanted to disrupt, remained ours, protected by boundaries that had been tested and proven strong enough to withstand even the most determined assault. We'd learned that family love doesn't require endless self-sacrifice, that boundaries are essential for healthy relationships, and that sometimes protecting what you've built means disappointing people who feel entitled to it. Most importantly, Alex had learned that his father would always prioritize his well-being over other people's demands, that his home was a sanctuary that would be defended against anyone who tried to violate it, and that real love sometimes means saying no to people who ask for too much. The desert sun set behind the mountains, painting the Phoenix sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I'd chosen to build our life in this challenging but beautiful place. Inside our house, Alex was finishing his homework at the kitchen table while dinner cooked on the stove, our evening routine uninterrupted by family drama or crisis management. This was the peace we'd fought for, the stability we'd protected, the life that remained ours because we'd been willing to defend it when it mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.